Welcome, everyone. Good to see everybody again. Had hopefully a good start to this year. I will start by maybe just a quick recap of what we covered in parts 1, 2, and 3. Given that there was a gap in between and we covered a lot of different things. Before we go into part 4 today. So let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, so part 4, as we know, is going to be focused on the knowledge of God through our experience, through consciousness itself. And that's where we're going to spend the rest of the time. I don't know how many sessions it will cover, but we'll see how it goes. But if we recall, in steps 1 to 3, we covered a whole range of different ways of coming to know about the existence and the nature of God. We started with science, which is the empirical evidence we can see from studying the world around us. And from the scientific analysis that we looked at, we saw that this world is contingent. It is a mumkin entity. It doesn't have to exist, but it does. And it is very ordered, very structured, and it is comprehensible. There's a system, an order, which we can come to understand through the use of mathematics. In the field of physics, we can actually model how the world works. And that's a very important observation. It is ordered, so it's not just random. There's a structure and an order to the universe. And that order can be understood by intelligent minds. So it is comprehensible, right? Comprehensible meaning that it can be understood. It makes sense to our intelligence. We also looked at biology and the information content in DNA, also suggesting that the source has intelligence in it. We then went on to talk about philosophy and thinking about God rationally, using our logic and using our rational minds. And we developed this concept of a necessary being, wajib al-wujud, a being that must exist. And that is essentially the source of the laws of physics, which then govern how the universe behaves. Right? So that's how we developed our understanding of God as a necessary being, as wujud itself. And we went on to look at different ways of understanding the nature of God. We looked at pantheism, we looked at a traditional dualistic view of God, and then I focused on a non-dual ahadi understanding of God as an infinite, self-aware being. Not a being, not an entity separate from the world, but being itself, al-wujud nafs. And we then developed that into more detail, looking at the concept of ahadiyya and wahidiyya as different levels of being, maratib al-wujud. And that we can think of this universe, this world, and ourselves as a manifestation of that infinite being. Okay, tajalliyat al-wujud, different ways that being is manifesting itself. And we used the screen as my favorite analogy, thinking of an infinite being like an infinite screen on which different images appear. They're not real, they don't live separately, they don't exist separately from the screen. They are manifested on the screen itself. And then we started to look at the role of human beings, al-insan, and looked at the human being as being a mirror of God himself, able to reflect and manifest all of the attributes of God in himself. And it's in particular, which is where we're going to focus now, is on consciousness, this awareness in us that allows us to be that perfect mirror for the divine. And for that reason, insan, the human being, is understood as being a manifestation of the name Allah, which is the name that combines all of the attributes together in a single name. It is the comprehensive name of God. And the human being is created under that name. It's almost that you think of it as a child of that particular name, and therefore able to manifest and reflect all of the different attributes, all the sifat Allah. Okay, and so that's where we got to last time. We started to look at consciousness and experience, and that's where we're going to go into detail, because it is precisely this. It is human beings' consciousness, this ruh in us, that is what allows us to become the perfect mirror. And so it raises that question of, what is consciousness? What is its nature? What can we know about it? And how can we use this understanding to then develop a deeper experience of our relationship with God? And that's what the part 4 is all about. And so it's a huge topic. I'm not going to go into all the detail, otherwise it will take us literally years. But I will approach it in a similar way to how we went through parts 1 to 3. We'll start by doing a scientific investigation of the nature of consciousness and experience. What is consciousness? What is experience? How can we study it scientifically using the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology? And we'll look at the neuroscience of the brain, because the brain is very closely connected to consciousness. And so we'll start there. We'll look at consciousness from a scientific point of view, see what we can learn about it from science. And then we'll go into the philosophy. Like we did with the nature of God himself, we're now going to do the same thing, a philosophical investigation, using our logic, using rational thinking to try to understand better the nature of consciousness and experience. And we will look at different viewpoints, just like we did different viewpoints about the nature of God. Now we'll do the same thing, looking at different viewpoints about the nature of consciousness and the world around us that we experience, okay? And then we'll go to the experiential dimension. So here, the focus is going to be on investigating consciousness in our direct experience. So now we're not thinking about it, we're not analyzing consciousness from the outside. You know, when we look at it from a science point of view, we're going to be looking at the brain. We're looking at consciousness from the outside, right? And then when we do philosophy, we're going to be thinking about consciousness and using the concepts, ideas to try to understand what consciousness is. But the unique thing about consciousness is that there is an internal perspective, right? We from a scientific perspective, we will analyze it from the outside. We will look at, a brain and how someone is having conscious experiences, and we look at what's going on in the brain. We're looking at the human being from the outside. But the unique thing about consciousness, which is different to anything else in the universe, is that there is another perspective that you can study consciousness from. You can study consciousness also from the internal perspective, from the first person perspective, right? The scientific approach is a third person perspective, from an outside. But experience, conscious experience ourselves, we can have that knowledge internally, directly by examining our own conscious experience from the inside, as it were. Okay, so we will look at what can we learn about our own conscious experience by closely investigating, how our experience works, and what can we learn from that. Okay, and then we'll develop that into an understanding of ourselves, our consciousness, and God's. And we will also look at some practical exercises that you can do yourself to then start to really get closer to these things and taste them for yourself and experience that non-duality that we've been talking about, both in the form of being and in consciousness. Okay, so that's the roadmap. As I said in our last session, consciousness, it's my favorite topic. It's a huge, very deep, very rich topic. And in today's world, it is almost the most important area of research that is happening right now. There's a very big, deep debate happening in the world today about all of these questions. What is consciousness? How does it come about? What is its nature? This is a huge area of focus today, an area of very active debate. So a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, I'm not going to present them as these are the answers. I'll share different research, different perspectives, different viewpoints, and then I'll share my own views and my own personal experiences with you. And then hopefully we'll have a good discussion about these things, because this is an area that is still very much open for discussion. All right, so that's the roadmap, and as you can see, the whole thing that we did for the nature of God is almost being repeated within the topic of consciousness. But we'll move relatively quickly. I promise we won't take too much time on this part, but it does cover all of these areas: science, philosophy, and spirituality, or experiential knowledge. All right, so with that, let me start with some definitions. What is consciousness? And when we say experience, you have an experience, what do we mean by experience? Okay, so we need some definitions. And it's very difficult to actually have a good, clear definition. Part of what's going on right now is that consciousness has not been something that has been researched until now, until recently, very much. And so even the definitions are not clearly agreed on by everyone. But let me start with some provisional definitions that we can use. So this is how I think is useful to define consciousness and experience. So consciousness is that in which all experience appears, with which all experience is known, and out of which all experience is made. Okay, so if you notice, we're talking about how it arises, how we know it, and what is experience actually made of. What we say here is that experience itself is made out of consciousness. It is known by consciousness, and all experience appears in consciousness. Okay. Another way of saying that in a very simple way, consciousness is what it feels like to be something. Okay, now doesn't have to be just a human consciousness, even animals. There is something it's like to be a cat, or something it's like to be a cow, or even more simple things like an insect. There is some kind of experience happening. There is a consciousness in living things, and that's what we mean by consciousness, what it feels like to be something. Okay. Now, what about experience, right? So I've used the words consciousness and experience. What is experience? Experience is all that is or could ever be known. It's a knowing. And that knowing can take the form of thinking, feeling, and perceiving. Okay? Thinking, everyone knows. Feeling is an emotion. Okay, when I say feeling, I'm talking about an emotion. Everyone knows what that emotion is like: happiness, sadness, fear. Those are feelings. And then perceiving, perception, right? The act of perceiving is when we use our senses to know things. So perceiving is seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, all of the senses that we use, those are giving us perceptions, right? Hearing perception, seeing perception, and these are known, and they are experiences that are known to us. Okay, so that's what we mean by experience, is thinking, feeling, perceiving, and that it covers everything that could ever be known. Right? That's what we mean by experience. And another way of thinking about it is that experience is consciousness plus an object. Okay? This will become more clear as we go forwards, but essentially you have consciousness, and then when you have an object, any kind of an object that appears in consciousness, we have an experience. We are aware of the object. We have the experience of knowing the object. So the experience is consciousness plus an object. Okay? So these are some basic definitions. It's a little bit tricky to get your head around if it's the first time you're hearing these things, but I hope that as we go through, these things will become more clear. All right. So next, before I go into science and the scientific investigation, I want to remind everyone, we talked about this before. This is just a quick reminder about the difference between science and philosophy. Remember, we said that science can only tell us about how nature behaves, not what it is in and of itself. Okay? The question of what is something made of, what is its nature, what is its essence, that is a question for philosophy. Okay, so we'll start with science and then we'll go to philosophy. And when we go to philosophy, if you remember, we talked about these are the things that are important when you're developing a good philosophical theory. Okay, to do good philosophy, you need to have these criteria. Your idea needs to be coherent, consistent, parsimonious, adequate empirically, and explanatorily powerful. Okay, we'll go into these again when we get to the philosophy part, but I wanted to just remind you that these are two different things. We'll study things and how they behave in science, and then we'll go to philosophy and start thinking about what is the true essence of the things that we are observing in nature. Okay, now let's go to the science. Now, I think everyone would be already aware that human consciousness seems to be very closely related to the brain, right? We know that, our brain activity, our brains are where all of our thinking happens and where we come to know things. And, if we have any problems with the brain, we know that it affects our consciousness. So we know that there's a close connection between the brain and consciousness. So that's where we will start in our scientific investigation. Okay. And so this area is called neuroscience, okay, or brain science, studying the brain as a system. All right. Because what we have found is that the brain and consciousness seem to be very closely connected to each other. So we'll get into all of that. All right. So I think everyone knows what this thing is. It's really amazing that everything that we experience seems to be related to this, little organ that you can hold in your hand. That is made of this really soft, gooey, wet stuff that we call the brain. And what we know is that the brain is made of cells called neurons. Okay. So every cell in the brain, well, I'm sorry, not all the cells, but the most important cells in the brain are called, brain cells. Another name for a brain cell is a neuron. Okay. They're actually pretty complex structures. This is a single neuron. Okay. It has these different parts like a nucleus, and then an axon, and then a node, and then it has these things called synapses. We don't need to go into all of that in detail, but a few things to know about the brain. Okay. The brain has around 86 billion neurons in it on average. Okay. And the amazing thing is, by the way, we are born with all of those neurons. Even a baby actually has the same number of neurons as you and me. The only thing that happens is that the neurons start to form connections with each other, like a network of interactions. So the baby is born without these connections. And as we grow, we form different connections between the neurons. That's what happens. But the neurons, all of them are there from day one. That's quite amazing, actually. Now, if we zoom into neurons, what we see is, so this diagram on the right-hand side here, you'll see an example of 3 neurons next to each other, okay? So we have one neuron here, we have a neuron up here, and a third one here, okay? And the only thing I want to point out is that this is just FYI, just to know that neurons actually don't touch each other. They don't, when I say they form connections, they don't actually even touch. So what you see here in this zoomed in diagram, it's a zoom in of where these 2 neurons come very close to each other. There's actually a gap between them. It's really interesting. So this is one neuron, and this is another neuron. And there's actually a gap between them. They never touch each other. It's called the synaptic cleft. A cleft is a gap. And what happens is that the neurons kind of communicate with each other by sending chemicals, particles between themselves. These little particles kind of move between them. And they attach from one side to the other side. Okay, so they kind of float between this gap from one nerve to the next nerve, and then they move from there. They never actually touch each other. There's a gap between them all, but they're all very, very closely positioned next to each other. Okay, so neurons interact with each other through these electrochemical signals that are sent between them, but the neurons don't actually touch each other. Okay, it's interesting. Now, through studying the brain over the last 50, 100 years, what we have found is through neuroscience, we've identified something called neural correlates of consciousness. Okay, it's a long name. You can just think of them as NCCs, okay? Neural correlates. What does this mean? What it means is that what we have observed is that if you have a particular pattern of neural activity, right? So this neuron communicating with this neuron and this one, or maybe another neuron far away, different patterns of interaction, they correlate with particular conscious experiences, okay? So for example, if you're feeling happy, okay, let's say you're feeling happy and we put you in a brain scanner. We have these equipment that we can actually scan your brain. What we find is when you're feeling happy, we can see from the brain scan that a certain part of your brain starts to become more active. Okay? And so it's correlated. When you have happiness, we see this part of the brain is becoming more active. More neurons are communicating with each other. More chemical signals are flying between them. Let's say if you look at something, vision, when you see something, a different part of the brain starts becoming more active. You see patterns of signals going between neurons in a different part of the brain, okay? And you see these different patterns associated with different experiences. When you feel fear, we scan your brain, we see a certain pattern of neuron activity, okay? So there's a correlation, and I'm going to go into this in more detail. There's a correlation, a connection between neural activity, right? The activity of the neurons, and what you are feeling, what you are experiencing as a conscious experience. And those connections, these kind of correspondence that we've discovered, those are called NCCs, okay? Neural correlates of consciousness. This kind of pattern, this kind of feeling. There's a correlation between them. Now, we'll study this in more detail. It's a very important question that is being discussed these days in a lot of detail. But that's all you need to know. And now you think, why do we need to study all of this? I thought we're talking about the nature of God. Well, we'll see that all of this matters a lot because there are people out there today, and in fact, I would say it's almost the majority view with scientists. They don't think consciousness is even real. They think it's a kind of strange phenomenon that just kind of happens. What's really there is just the brain. There's no real such thing as consciousness. They actually believe that. So if we are going to talk about God as being infinite, self-aware being, and if we're going to talk about ourselves as being conscious beings, then we need to establish that consciousness is real. And what is it? What is its nature? Is it just matter, right? Is it just stuff, physical matter? Because if it is, then there's nothing particularly special happening. It's just an arrangement of different atoms. So that's why we're talking about all of this, okay? And this is what science has shown us, that there is this part of the body called the brain. It has these neurons. The neurons kind of communicate with each other. They send chemical signals between them. And when we have conscious experiences, we can correlate those with different patterns of activity between those neurons. Okay, so that's the scientific part that I wanted to explain and have you guys just have at least a basic understanding. Because if you talk to an atheist or a materialist, they'll tell you, look, you think you are some spiritual being, you're a human being, you're special. It's just atoms moving around. There's nothing else there. So these topics become very important to establish the nature of who we really are. All right, with that, we'll go a little bit into the philosophy part. As I said, this part we'll move much faster than we did last time. And so already we're going to talk about some of the questions that arise when we start trying to understand what is the nature of consciousness, okay? Because science can't tell us that, remember. Science can only tell you, look, there are these correlations. There's this thing called the brain, and there's this activity of neurons, and there's this conscious experience. That's it. That's what science can tell us. Science cannot tell us anything beyond that. Philosophy now has to tell us what's actually going on, okay? So the question becomes, where do we start, right? What can we actually know about ourselves and the world? What do we know for sure? What can we really be confident that we know? And if you think about it, we spend so many sessions talking about the universe and thinking about God and being and mind and all these things. And yet that was all kind of looking out on the world and thinking about things. We never actually questioned, but hang on, how do we know anything, right? What does the process of knowing, knowledge, how does it arise? How confident can we be about knowing anything? Okay, so this field is called epistemology. It's part of philosophy, and it's the study of knowledge. How does knowing come about? Okay, in Arabic or in Islamic philosophy, it's in ma'rifah, right? Ilm al-ma'rifah. So how do we come to know things? So let's start. Where can we start? Where do we start? We start with experience. And the reason is because we know that experience exists. We know that we are having experiences. All right, that's the starting point. Now, we'll talk about, the idea of matter, right? Something like this pen, what is it made of? Normally, we think it's made of matter. We'll talk about that. But actually, what we have to remember is that we have a mind in which or with which we know things, right? If you don't have a mind, you can't know this pen, right? You have to have a mind to know. And everything that we know through the mind, okay? Now, before we talk about objects, let's talk about ourselves. Self-awareness, okay? The awareness that you have that you exist, right? You know that you exist. That is the foundation of all knowledge, okay? And why do I say that? Because that knowledge, knowing that you exist, you can know directly without recourse to anything else. You don't need anything else to know that you exist. Okay, why do I say that, or how come? Well, let's go back to this pen. In order for me to know this pen, first of all, just using it as an example, first of all, there would need to be light. Can I know this pen exists without light? I wouldn't know. I wouldn't be able to see the pen, right? Or know that it's there. So I would need light. Then the light has to come through my eyes. I have to have eyes. Otherwise, I cannot see the pen. Then the eyes have to then send some kind of a signal, right? That creates an image of the pen in my mind, right? Just think about it. When I see the pen, does the pen enter my eyes and go into my brain? No, it doesn't, right? The pen only gets reflected by the light, and there's an image, a picture of the pen appears in my mind, and that's what I know. I see an image of the pen, right? The pen doesn't go into my head or through my eyes, thank God. right? So what I'm saying is just obvious, but sometimes we forget these things. Everything that we know, we actually know it through our minds. The objects of experience are experienced in the mind. And so we never actually have access to this thing that we think is a pen directly. I cannot have that direct experience, direct access to it. I always know it through my mind. Okay, that's important, because now if you think about this knowledge of the pen, it was dependent on a lot of things. Light, my eyes have to work, and then my mind has to register this picture of the pen. I need many things to know the pen. But knowing that I exist, just me as pure awareness, just think about that. What do you need to know that you exist? Nothing. This is a knowledge that you know directly. And we will examine this in more detail. We will do some exercises to examine this. But if we had no senses at all, okay, imagine you were born without any senses, no seeing, no hearing, no touching, nothing. You have no senses, okay? So you have no way to know the outside world, right? You're not even aware of your body because you have no senses. Would you be aware? Yes, you'll still be aware. Would you be aware of yourself? You would know that you exist? You would. You don't need the senses to know that you exist. Okay? So that's the key point that I'm making, that self-awareness, this knowledge, I am, I exist, is very different to all the other things that we know. It is the most reliable knowledge that we have. Because I see this pen, but maybe my eyes don't work well, or I'm colorblind, which I actually am. I'm colorblind. So I might not see the colors clearly, right? My eyes can be faulty. They might not work well, right? So there's some reliability issues, but just the knowledge I am is totally reliable, doesn't depend on anything else. Okay, but this is the key thing to just keep in mind, that we don't have access to things outside ourselves directly. We know everything and we see everything through our minds. Okay? Now, we also cannot know anything independent of our minds, right? We can't step outside of our mind and experience things directly or know things directly, right? Everything we know is dependent on the mind. These are very important things to remember, okay? Now, what we will then focus on when trying to examine what is the nature of the world and consciousness, there are three fundamental facts of our experience that we will need to explain, okay? And I'm just, today, I think I'll just end by talking about these three facts of experience. And then from next session, inshallah, we'll start looking at different viewpoints, different theories of trying to explain these three facts. Okay, so we'll look at a few different viewpoints. But the whole objective will be that we want to explain these fundamental facts of experience. Now, when I tell you what they are, they're going to sound very obvious. But this is very important, because what we'll find is that all of us have grown up with a very basic assumption that we're making about the world to explain these three things, but we haven't really thought about it very carefully. And here we're going to dig very deep and be very precise to understand how to understand these different facts of experience. Okay, they're going to be very simple facts, but there are different ways that we can explain these facts. It's very important. There's not just one way that we can explain them. So let me go into them and it'll become a bit more clear. Fact number one, we seem to inhabit a shared world, right? When I look out and I see the world out there, and you see the world out there, we seem to be able to describe the same world, right? So right now I'm sitting in my study in this room, and I have a desk, and I have a computer, and I have some books on a shelf. And if you were in the same room with me, you would describe the same thing, right? Maybe a slightly different perspective, because you will have, you a certain angle you will be looking at, and I will be looking at it from a different angle slightly, but we will generally agree that we are in a room with books and a computer and a desk. And so we inhabit a shared world. Very obvious, right? But we want to understand why, or how do we understand this shared world? That's fact number one. Okay. Another way of saying this is that, I'm a person. I have a limit to who I am. I have a mind. I have my mind, and lots of things happen in my mind that are not happening in your mind, right? I have thoughts and feelings that happen in my mind. You have thoughts and feelings that happen in your mind. But somehow we seem to be able to agree on this shared world, right? The shared world doesn't depend on, my thoughts and my feelings. We kind of agree that, yeah, that's the world. And then, what happens inside me is very particular to me. What's going on inside you is very different from that. And they don't have to be the same. But what's happening in the outside world, we all agree on it. So how is that? Why is that? That's what we mean by fact number one. We seem to inhabit a shared world. Fact number two, we cannot change the outside world through our own volition, through our own choice. Okay? Again, sounds very obvious, but these are just, be patient with me. You'll see why this is all very important, that we start from scratch and then we build up our understanding of the world, starting from scratch without making lots of assumptions, jumping from one idea to another and just assuming things, because that's where we make mistakes. Let's start from the basic facts. So fact number two is, I can think things in my mind and I can change my thoughts and my feelings and everything inside me. But when it comes to the outside world, I cannot just make things change by just choosing to do that, right? Through thinking it. I can't change the world based on what I want it to be. Believe me, if I could, this world would look very different to what we see. I wouldn't like to keep this world of conflict and suffering and killing and all these things. I wish I could change all of that, but I can't, right? How come I can change things inside me? I cannot change what's going on in the outside world. We need to be able to explain that. That's fact number two. And then fact number three. We talked about this already, but it's also an important fact that we have to be able to explain with our philosophy. And that is that there is this tight correlation, very strong correlation between brain activity and conscious experiences. I talked about that already. So we see that these things happen together, this type of experience, and I see this type of activity between the neurons in the brain. So I need to be able to explain that, right? It's clearly something related to experience, right? All of these things are to do with experience. Step one, fact number one, we inhabit a shared world. I experience a shared world the same as you. Fact number two, I can't change the outside world. I cannot use my consciousness to change the outside world directly, right? I can't just use my consciousness, my mind, and change the outside world. So it's related to consciousness and experience. And then the third one, same thing. I've got conscious activity and I have this thing called the brain and brain activity, and they're very closely correlated. So how can I explain all that? Right? What are the ways in which we explain it? Now, what we're used to and I'm going to stop here for today. But what we're very used to is the idea that the world outside is made of something we call matter, right? Mud. It's a physical world, right? This pen is a physical object. It's made of this substance we call matter, which is made of atoms and electrons and things like that, right? And that's what the world outside is made of. And then there's my mind. My mind is not made of this physical world. It's consciousness. It's different. And so that's how we kind of just almost automatically, we've grown up in that sort of a way of thinking about the world, right? There's the physical, and then there's the mental, right? And so, why do we inhabit a shared world? Well, because it's a physical world. It's, that's what it is out there. It doesn't depend on my mind. It's just out there. It doesn't depend on your mind. It doesn't depend on my mind. It's a physical world outside of minds, right? That's what we think. And that's why I can't change it, because it's made of physical stuff. I can't change it with my mind. And then we kind of grow up, most people, if they've thought about this, they'll think, yeah, well, somehow the brain must be generating consciousness, right? If these things are so correlated, right? The brain activity creates the conscious experience, right? If I change the brain activity, right? If I send different signals into your brain using a magnet or something, I can change your experience of the world, right? Or, we know something like alcohol can do that, right? There's alcohol, you drink the alcohol. I haven't drunk it before, but from what I understand, you drink the alcohol, it goes into your system, it affects the way your brain works, the neurons, and that's why your conscious experience changes, right? That's what we grow up with. And that's one way of understanding this, one way of explaining these facts, which is called materialism. Although it's a little bit confused, what is the mind? What is matter? How are they connected? But, we make an assumption every day. We've grown up with this idea that there's a physical world out there made of something called matter, physical matter. And we use that as a way of explaining these three facts, okay? Now, we'll look at that next time, and we'll look at what problems there are in that view, actually. There are a lot of problems with this view that the world out there is made of matter. Most people are not even aware of it. They haven't thought about it. And what we'll show you is that there are other ways of understanding the nature of your consciousness and the world out there that can explain these three facts without the concept of matter, without assuming that there's anything physical out there. That's the kind of thing we're going to explore. I just wanted to, plant that seed of an idea in you, because I think most people, like myself, when I first started to look at this, just assume that there's something called matter, something physical. There's a physical world like my body or like this pen, and then there's a mental, the mind is something different. And that's just an assumption. We haven't really studied it, investigated it. And that's what we're going to spend more time examining, those assumptions. Okay? So I'll stop there for today. Hopefully not too technical, and I hope you'll see the relevance of all of this as we go forward. Why are we bothering with all of this? I tried to put a bit of a foundation for you, because when you talk about the existence of God and the nature of God and the nature of mind, because we think that God, doesn't have a mind per se, but is conscious. God is aware, is intelligent, and so are we. And we are, we have a spiritual dimension to us. That's what we believe. And so the question becomes, why do you believe that? What's your proof? What's the evidence for any of that, right? That's why these things become important, just like in part one, where we used our scientific analysis to look at what evidence is there to support your belief in God, right? Why do you believe in God? What is the basis of that, right? How do you have a debate about that with someone who doesn't believe in God, right? What are you going to provide as support for your view? And so we need to do the same thing when it comes to consciousness. Otherwise, you'll find that all of your views are going to get completely dismissed, because a materialist will just say to you, look, all there is matter, and that's it. Now the matter has become very complex, and it looks like it's aware and it's intelligent. It's just matter bouncing around. There's no meaning behind it. There's no value behind it. It's all meaningless. That's what they say. So these topics, I think personally, are crucially important. And that's why, I just like I said the first time when we went through part one, be patient with it if it's not particularly interesting for you. I think it's an important foundation to begin with. And then we will get into the experiential dimension of consciousness, and we will investigate that as well. Okay.